Lyndon Johnson grew up in the hill country of Texas, the son of an attentive but demanding mother and the financially struggling father who was a state legislator. As a legislator, LBJ's father supported the rights of poor people, and he opposed the Ku Klux Klan. LBJ's mother told her son that the purpose of having power was to do people some good. And as Lyndon grew up and aggressively gained power, first in the U.S. House of Representatives and then in the U.S. Senate, he did try to do people some good through constant, direct, behind-the-scenes negotiations with his Democratic and Republican colleagues on the basis of favors given and favors taken back. He started working in Washington, D.C. during the early years of the Great Depression. He was inspired by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Much later, in 1957, as the Senate Majority Leader, LBJ got the first piece of civil rights legislation passed since the days of Southern Reconstruction after the Civil War. At the dawn of the 1960s, he became Vice President to John F. Kennedy, and 3 years later President after JFK's assassination in Dallas. As President, LBJ did a lot of people a lot of good. He got legislation passed to create Medicare and Medicaid. He got civil rights legislation passed that outlawed discrimination based on race, ethnicity, religion, gender, or national origin in workplaces, schools, and public facilities. He also got the Voting Rights Act passed, which prohibited racial discrimination and the right to vote. And then LBJ's world fell apart. He had quietly conducted a rapidly escalating war in Vietnam, thinking he had to do it to stop the aggressive global spread of communism. After all, that's why the U.S. had fought in Korea in the 1950s, and JFK had confronted the USSR over nuclear missiles in Cuba in 1962. But the Civil War in Vietnam wasn't really about communism, and for the U.S., it went nowhere. The American public eventually wanted to get out of it, mostly because it was a failure, as more than 50,000 young Americans died fighting in it. Youth that faced getting drafted against their will to fight this meaningless war protested it long and hard in the streets and on college campuses. Meanwhile, a week after the equal voting rights legislation became law, a race riot broke out in Los Angeles, which was the beginning of years of riots in various cities all around the nation. LBJ was devastated, but he eventually understood that his legislation to support African Americans was far too little, far too late for a brutally oppressed people who still were not getting their share of the American dream of prosperity and equality. A president who had been elected by a landslide in 1964 dropped out of contention for re-election in 1968 and retreated back to the hill country of Texas, where he died a few years later from a heart attack.